this building will come down hopefully in 3-4 months, and we will be moving the tea house to the other side of this wall, and so we hope to be able to continue this kind of program. And finally, I just want to tell you, when Sixth City House donated this tea house, they assured us all the lumber was Northwest lumber. So they took the logs back and they finished it to the Japanese size, and then they packaged it and sent it back here. So I don't know if Jan was council person. No, probably not at that time. But anyway, it has a lot of history in it, so we want to preserve it as long as we can. Again, thank you very much for attending, and Elaine will introduce our guest speaker.
Before we get into the program, there's always a little bit of housekeeping and a little bit of a commercial, if you will. Our foundation is a 501c3. It's called the Hope Bay Hochi Foundation. Tony and I got together and cahoots to put together this 501c3. I've worked with Tomio for many years, and that's the Japanese for the North American Post newspaper, which you have on your tables. And so we thought, again, it's Tomio's vision that it would be great to establish, a 501c3 so we can carry on some work that perhaps the newspaper could not do. And I think in the 3 years that I've been working with Tomio on this foundation, we have been able to make, a little progress in that regard. First, programs like this is great because it's not something that the newspaper staff really have time to do. And second, a great project. I really hope that you'll go in to the back and look at some of those really interesting historical titles. The North American Post started up after the war. My grandfather was an early publisher, editor of the newspaper right after the war ended. And it was a great time to come back and say we're going to reestablish the community after the internment camps. So the North American Post actually began under that name in 1946. You'll see the first issue back there in June of 1946. And then from then on, take a look at those articles because they were all in Japanese. Because again, remember, this was mostly first generation. And their Japanese was their primary language. Prior to the war, it was North American Times, Hokubei Jiji. And so we are digitizing all 150,000 pages of both the newspapers. And we're excited to do that. We've made a lot of progress. We're hoping that donors, individual supporters like Tosh and Toshi, they come to every single event. Thank you very much. They don't even need to RSVP because they're going to be at the event. But people like that in the community is really what, donors that are individuals, small, $10 will scan 250 pages. And that will add up. And we're do you have a question?
No, I just...
Oh. Yeah, okay.
It's impressive.
Yeah, I mean, that's a lot of pages. University of Washington Libraries is our partner. So they're doing a lot of the scanning. A lot of it's interns. But again, we need the bilingual translators as well, because a lot of the titles are going to be from Japanese to English. So on your tables, we've just got little modest envelopes, a 2-page summary of the project. If it grabs you in any way, you have $5, you have 10, 25 or more, we welcome it. And of course, we'll acknowledge you. You'll have your name listed as one of the supporters, give you your tax deduction confirmation. So thank you so much for that. Oh, the furisode is a beautiful kimono. It could be hung like that, or generally in Japan, it's for young unmarried women. I think it's when they turn 21?
20.
There's some, one of the landmark ages, they often, it's a formal kimono. That was donated from one of our interns, mother from Japan. So again, that's on a silent auction, and then we have a Japanese doll in case. And finally, the emergency survival kits, we started promoting that right after the tsunami earthquake. to try to promote education, and that some of it goes back to Japan, and then some of it comes to the foundation. So please consider purchasing one of those bags. I think, Tomio, what's on sale right now? Is it $29 on sale? Okay, so that's a good deal, because there's a lot of emergency material in that kit. Okay, so we are just pleased. I don't have a long introduction of Joby. I just know, watching you grow up and knowing your mother a lot more. B, you've been in the community we've all been in the community a long time and doing a lot of different things, and with Jan and, you know, Hank and everyone. It's great to see Joby, and when Tomio and I talked about you coming, it just was a no-brainer. It was like, wow, someone coming up, already established, I mean, chief of staff, you know, highest ranking in the, you know, governor's office, and can't imagine all the things that you're doing now. So we thought it would just be a great opportunity. You can, if you don't mind, since I don't have a long introduction, I know you have a lot of other history there, share a little bit about that. We're a real informal group, so we'd like to just be able, I have questions myself to be able to ask. So without further ado, we'd just like to introduce Joby. She's Chief of Staff with Governor Jay Inslee's office.
I'm going to do a little dance too, dance number later. Thank you, Elaine, and thank you, Tomio, and the folks at the foundation for this opportunity to embarrass myself thoroughly. Some folks know that I really have a hard time speaking in public, so bear with me. Half my family's here because they don't get to see me at any other time, but I wanted to recognize my mom, Biki O'Hara, who is in the audience. And Jan Kumasaka and Ham Kumasaka. So I thought I'd actually just spend a few moments just kind of telling my story, just so you get an idea of where I grew up, how I grew up, and how I got to where I am today. So I was born in Lawrence, Kansas, and that always throws people off when they hear that I was born in the Midwest. But my mom and dad moved out to Lawrence when my dad became an art professor at the University of Kansas. And we were out there for a handful of years. I have an older brother and a younger sister. We're all 2 years apart. And my parents got a divorce when I was about 2. And my mom schlepped us kids back to Seattle, where both sides of our family is from. And ended up finding this awesome little house on Beacon Hill near 19th and Spokane. And we ended up living out there in a fantastic neighborhood. And was really raised by a lot of folks in this room, both from the community and the world of politics. And I remember sitting, I eavesdropped a lot on my mom's conversations and meetings. So my mom was very involved in the community, starting, she's an artist, and she started the Northwest Asian American Theater just down the street, I don't know, 30 years ago. And was the artistic director for many, many years, but really helped pull together the community and convince elected officials and community members that it was really important to have a place for emerging Asian American artists who were actors, performers, writers, producers, directors, and she thought it was really important for this community to have this artistic, cultural voice for our community. And so she would rally folks and get people into our living room to talk about the importance of this, and she would testify before the city council, and so, you know, being a single mom of 3 kids, we were around a lot with her and her community endeavors. And so I would eavesdrop, you know, behind sofas while she was having her meetings, and it was all just sort of fascinating and interesting, this idea of pulling people together around a cause and an issue, and then just watching things happen. And so as a result of her cajoling and pushing and leadership, there was a theater for our community here. And so being able to kind of grow up in that environment is pretty significant. Being able to grow up where it's, you know, you've got an aunt who is running for the Seattle School Board or for the state legislature and incredibly engaged in education issues. You kind of grow up thinking that this is kind of normal and you don't really know anything different, right? Sort of like voting when you have parents who vote, take you to the voting booth, but you know, now filling out absentee ballots, it just becomes a normal thing and you end up becoming a voter. So growing up in that house on Beacon Hill, being exposed to community engagement and that kind of leadership, it was kind of a natural thing for folks in our family and our community to kind of see and do. I ended up going to Kimball Elementary School, a little neighborhood. We've got a lot of Beacon Hill posse here, right in this little corridor here. And it was a really great experience. And then I ended up going to Whitman Middle School up in the North End and had a friend who was involved in this organization called Kids Board. And it was at the time when Charlie Royer was mayor. And he really wanted to make Seattle a kid-friendly place. And so he wanted to engage young people in city planning and city initiatives that would affect young people. And so I thought it kind of sounded cool and applied to be on this kids board and got chosen to represent young people along with a bunch of other kids from throughout the city. And I think I was about 12 or 13 at the time, probably 12 because it was still in middle school. And it was one of the best experiences. It's one of the places where I met Jenna Drago, former Seattle City Council member and King County Council member, and it was a completely life-changing experience. So here I was, a young person, being engaged in all of these city-wide issues that affected young people. From, you know, I think the mayor at the time wanted to instill a teen curfew. And to his credit, had a community conversation involving young people about that. There were attempts at the county level to raise Metro bus fares on young people. We started a teen hotline to help prevent teen suicide and house that at the YMCA. We were able to do a bunch of different things to help young people. And it was just an incredible platform and incredibly empowering. To be engaged, to be asked, to have a voice, and to see that impact. And then the other important piece to that engagement was just developing relationships. So being able to meet all sorts of people and develop relationships and work with folks soon became incredibly helpful in the next 10 years down the road for me. I didn't really know it at the time, but obviously looking back, and I'm sure you guys all hear that, the relationships really, really matter, and especially in public service and politics and government. And so after that experience, well, that continued on into high school. I ended up going to Ingram High School and continued my volunteer work, and then also ended up, through my volunteer work, meeting another great mentor, Norm Rice. So when I was 16, I decided I've done a lot of volunteer work, and now I can legally get a job. And I thought, oh, I'd like to go and work for the summer and make some money while I was in high school. And wrote Norm Rice a note. He was actually running for Congress at the time. This was in 1988. And he was running for Congress against Jim McDermott in the primary. And I thought, oh, it might be kind of fun to go work on his campaign. So I wrote him a note and said, hey, I'm 16, I want a job. Is there anything available on your campaign for the summer? And a couple weeks went by, he called me in his office and was like, well, I don't have a job on the campaign, but my staffer is going to take a leave, and we might need some help around the office. We can hire, legislative interns for the summer. And I was like, that sounds awesome. And so I ended up, after school, I don't know, a few times a week, going into the city council office and helping out with all sorts of, office work. And it was the most awesome experience ever. Meeting all of these incredible, engaged, smart, dedicated professionals and elected officials and community leaders. and just being exposed to that was really, really thrilling. And I was really lucky. Their staff ended up finding more money, and I kept on and stayed until he decided to run for mayor in '89, and then ended up volunteering every waking moment I could on that campaign. And so I think that's when my grades started to take a turn for the worse. It was just spending time around all these energetic, hardworking people, and just catching that campaign buzz was really, really thrilling. And so I remember after school, I would go to the office, and then I would go and volunteer on the campaign, and then I remember at night, people waking me up because I'd fall asleep at the campaign headquarters while I was trying to do homework and doing some volunteer work. But it was so, so fun. And so when Mayor Rice won that campaign, I ended up becoming a planning intern in his office and helped with a couple of really fun civic events. And then ended up, it was my senior year, and I thought I was going to go to college. And I applied to Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., and turns out I didn't get in. So I got rejected from Georgetown, which my mother, who was an administrator at Seattle Central Community College, knew my grades were not awesome. And she knew I wasn't going to be able to get into Georgetown, but she thought I had applied to Evergreen. I don't know if you remember this. So she was like, oh, Evergreen, that's going to be a perfect school for you. I'm so excited. This is going to be great. And so I made the call to her. Didn't get into Georgetown. She's like, oh, honey, that's fine, because there's always Evergreen. And Evergreen is great. I mean, this would have been a perfect school for me. But I had to tell her that I didn't actually apply to Evergreen. And she was a little shocked, to say the least. But it turns out, so then I called my dad, told him I didn't get into Georgetown, and he kind of paused and said, well, you don't have to go to college in order to live in an exciting place. You could just live there. And it was like, oh my gosh, that's right. And a light bulb went off, and I was like, I didn't even want to go to college, actually. I didn't want to even go to school. I just wanted to be in Washington, D.C., which is why I picked Georgetown. And it was like a profound moment for me. And then I think the next call was to my mom. It's like, guess what? I'm moving to Washington, D.C. And then, that maybe some fighting and arguments kind of happened for the next couple weeks.
19, no job.
Yeah, so I was 18, just graduated from high school. I didn't have a job. I wasn't sure where I was going to stay. And so, looking back on it, yeah, kind of crazy, right? I totally see where my mom was coming from. But I'm a little stubborn, and she knows that. And I was just dead set on, I'll give myself a few, till the end of the year, and I will go on a bunch of interviews, talk to a bunch of folks, and just see what happens. But, a lot of people's advice was, you just need to go out there and then look for a job. It's just so much easier. And so I ended up moving out to Washington, D.C. I think it was January of, I don't know, was it 1991? It was the day the Iraq Crown War broke out. I remember that because my mom is very theatrical and dramatic. I remember her saying, and this is what you get for coming today. This is exactly. I remember her saying, I sent my baby on a plane the day the Ground War broke out. So that's why that date sticks out. Anyway, so I went to D.C. It was an incredible experience. I got there and had a lot of informational interviews, and a lot of people just sort of patted me on the head going, good luck. And, they were like, okay, so you just graduated from college? I'm like, no, just graduated from high school. A very entry-level position. Ideally, I wanted to work within our congressional delegation. And I was in Jim McDermott's office talking with his chief of staff, and I think he may have actually called my Aunt Jan and said, what is she doing here? Do you know how dangerous this city is? You know how competitive it is to get jobs? Why is she here? She really needs to go back. And so, you know, as a consolation, you can kind of let me sit in the front desk there, in the reception area, to update my resume. And so I was sitting there updating my resume, and I remember this guy coming in, good-looking guy in a suit, and he had this little briefcase, and he thought I worked there. And he handed me his resume. He was like, I'm looking for an entry-level position. So, you know, give me a call if you guys have anything available. And I took his resume, and I was like, okay. And he went down the hall to the next, I mean, he was just, you know, office hopping. So I took the resume, I looked at it, and it was like Harvard law graduate, you know, Yale undergrad, all this incredible experience. And I'm like, oh my gosh. And he's looking for the same position I'm looking for. And so I gave the resume to one of the staffers there, and I said, here, he just came by and dropped off his resume. And she took the resume, and she didn't even look at it, and she threw it in the recycling. Oh. And I'm like, what do you do? You're not even looking at it. And she was like, oh, we get tons of these every day. And it was just sort of like another light bulb went off, and was like, oh, okay. And so we had a conversation about what's the best way to get jobs here. And she was like, it's not going door to door if you don't know anyone. It's, you really need to have a relationship. You really need to know someone so that they can vouch for you, because it's so competitive. And at that time, I had done a couple of informational interviews, and one happened to be for Congressman John Miller from the 1st Congressional District in Washington State. He was the congressman before Maria Cantwell in the 1st. And so I had an informational interview with his office. He was a Republican, and they had a couple of positions open. And I was just like, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to, I don't know what's going to happen here, but it's possible if I get offered a job by this Republican, I might be working for a Republican. And I ended up taking some time to kind of think about, okay, like, that was sort of a good reality check. And then a couple days later, Congressman John Miller's office called and said, hey, we've got these 2 job openings. Would you be interested in one of them? And one was for a legislative correspondent, person who writes letters to constituents, responding on behalf of the member. And then the other one was an assistant press secretary, and it was to assist the current press secretary. And I thought, oh my gosh, wow. And I kind of played back the tape in my head of, you know, all of the disheartening conversations and the resume story, and it was like, okay, I should probably take one of these jobs. It's somebody in the delegation, and they're offering me an entry-level position. And so I told her I'd have to think about it for a day, and I'd get back to her the next day. And I made 2 calls. I called Charlie Royer and wanted to get his advice, and said, hey, I'm thinking about this job, but it's for a Republican. And he's like, John's a decent guy, but you should ask yourself, can you hold your head up and say, I work for John Miller? If you can, you should think about that. And then Charlie said nothing but nice things about John. And then the second call was to my mom, and who's just been like the most progressive, human being on the planet, and hardcore Democrat, and I was just kind of prepared for not the response that I got. But I asked her, and she said, John Miller is a decent man. And she's thinking, my baby needs a job. And so anyway, it was one of the best decisions early on in my career, was to go work for John, and a Republican in the Washington State delegation, especially at that time. And I learned so much hands-on in that role, in that experience. I learned that, my impressions of partisan politics were totally out of whack, that working for John Miller, who was a very moderate Republican, I was very proud of my time on his staff. and got to know some really neat people who are doing some pretty extraordinary things back here in Washington State now. And it was far from the fear that a lot of people had for me, that, oh, Washington's a cool place, it's hard, you're not going to like it, you're really going to miss home, and it couldn't have been more different. People were so welcoming and willing to befriend you. You know, everyone out there were, you know, from somewhere else, and so it was really neat, and they all cared about government and politics, and were incredibly engaged. So it was a really fun time to be there. I ended up being there for about a year and a half. And then moved back to Seattle and started working for Sharon Maeda and Spectra Communications, and ended up doing that for a year, helped manage the Nippon Kan Theater, and helped start up the JCC. That was in '92, and that's where I kind of learned that I'm a startup person. I'm not a long-term job person. And so I get into these jobs, and you know, after 1 year, 2 years, I start getting a little antsy. And so I ended up in 1993 working on a campaign, the anti-601, 602 campaign, and was the King County field coordinator. And it was really fun, a lot of hard work. Did that for about 11 months. And then in '94, I ended up managing Kip Takuta's campaign for the state legislature. He ended up running against the person who got appointed to Gary Locke's seat in that district. And he won. And then I worked on a school levy race in the city as their field coordinator. And then worked for Tina Papadowski, who ran for Seattle City Council in 1995. And then in late 1995, met this guy. He was a former congressman from the 4th Congressional District. Didn't know much about him. Had heard that he decided that he was going to run for governor in '96 when Mike Lowry was running. And his name is Jay Inslee. Met him, and I wasn't sure what I was going to do. Was doing a bunch of campaigns and loved it, but I could have done something else. And so I remember meeting him at the inauguration party for city council members, and we agreed to go have coffee. And I sat down with Jay and his wife Trudy up at Uptown Espresso in Queen Anne, and ended up spending over 2 hours with these guys, and walked away from that meeting thinking I would do anything for these people. I mean, they're just, you know, you meet people and you just kind of go, yeah, these are really good, decent people. And was very excited. He ended up asking me to run his campaign for governor in 1996. Total long shot. This was against Mike Lowry, and way before Gary Locke and Norm Rice ended up getting into the race. And so obviously that didn't work out in '96. I ended up, after that, becoming the political director for the Washington State Democratic Party. That was in '97. So I helped recruit candidates, helped put together their campaign training, and helped put together their legislative races and that legislative program for that year. Did that for about a year, and quit that to run Jay Inslee's '98 race for Congress in the 1st Congressional District. It's kind of funny how things kind of come around. So Jay Inslee ended up running against incumbent Rick White, a Republican, in '98, and I ran that race. He won, and then he asked me to go back to DC to be his chief of staff, which I reluctantly did. I thought I did my DC thing, it was so fun, but he's a pretty convincing guy. He was like, oh, just come out for a new member orientation. How do I get started? You know, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh my gosh, we gotta hire this person, we gotta hire that person, and then, you know, you just get something. So I ended up staying out and being his chief of staff for about 6 years. And yeah, 6 years later, it's really hard in these 2-year cycles, right? In these really competitive districts where you've got to be raising money, and you've got candidates being recruited against you. You know, you're in office, you win, and then you immediately have to, you know, start campaigning again for re-election. So we went through a couple of hard, competitive cycles, and then it was finally like, I've got to leave. I've got to do something else. And so after 6 years, decided to quit. Wasn't sure what I was going to do next, but knew that it was just time for me to do something different. So I ended up taking about 6 months off and just trying to figure out, what would make me happy, waking up every day. And at that time, I started getting into stained glass. I'd taken a class with 6 senior citizens up in Everett, and it was so fun. And you take these classes and they make you buy all of the materials, and so I had everything. And so I set up a little spot in my home at the time and started doing it on the side, and just decided, I think, finding a little studio in Pioneer Square and just waking up every day and spending the entire day in the studio making stained glass panels would make me really happy. And of course, I had no plan to do this, but I just did it. So ended up finding a spot in Pioneer Square, the 619 Western building, an old artist loft building, and ended up staying in that space for about 5 years. And it was really fun, and it was really, really hard. But it ended up finding a neat little community of artists out there. And then the last 5 years of that little stint, the last 3 years of that, I started helping Jay out again. He, in 2010, the Republicans had hired a candidate to run against him. I think to weaken him, make him spend his money, and beat him up going into a potential 2012 campaign cycle. And so I was helping him out on the side, and then ended up putting the glass on hold, and in 2010, we put together a campaign for him for Congress to maintain his seat. And that year was a really hard year for Democratic incumbents in Congress. The Tea Party was really, really strong. And you could see a lot of the folks Democratic members that he served with that year, who used to get 10, 20% bumps, were starting to look incredibly vulnerable. So we put together a campaign and ran that race and did pretty well for a Democratic incumbent. And then I just stayed on the campaign side. He was starting to think about running for governor, and we still had a bunch of political work to do. So I ended up staying on and ran his race in 2012 for governor. It was probably one of the hardest things any of us on the campaign had ever done, in part because nobody thought we could actually do it. And it was really, really difficult. But he won, and then immediately you've got to turn around and put together your transition team. And so from campaign to transition, and then boom, in January, you've got your inauguration, and folks expect you to have your government and your legislative program and your budget priorities all laid out. And so it was a pretty intense, all-consuming cycle. I ended up going to Olympia, agreeing to help him out for the first year as a senior advisor. So he said, come down to Olympia and help me out. I'm like, I'm not a sucker. Turns out I am a sucker. So he said, what would it take for you to come down and do this? And I was like, well, and I was kind of joking, but I was like, if I could just talk to you and Trudy and recruit our executive team and help recruit cabinet and just, that's it. Like, that's all I want to do. And then, help advise the team and you on, strategy and get everything aligned and focused. That's all I want to do. He's like, okay, great, done. And so I started off just helping recruit our executive team members and help recruit our cabinet, and helped him kind of navigate through some of this stuff. And then ended up being asked to be his chief of staff when our original chief of staff decided to do something else. And so that change happened in, I think, last November, and just kind of made sense for me to play this role. So it's been overwhelming, all-consuming. It's an enormous job, but the only reason why I agreed to do it was not only is he a really terrific person to work for, but we have the most dynamic, capable team, both in the governor's office and in our cabinet. They do an incredible job and make my job a lot easier than you'd think. So that's where we are today. And one of the challenges right now that I and some of the enterprise is facing is just we've had some really challenging things come up, like the Skagit County Bridge collapsing, and especially this 530 slide that's happened. So there are things that happen in your administration that you don't really anticipate. You're always warned that you're going to have some crisis, some tragedy, disaster, and we've seen a couple of them. And so I think our big long-term challenge is figuring out how to anticipate, plan for these things happening, while continuing to really be focused on the things that you want to get done proactively in your administration, and that's part of your agenda. So we're kind of wrestling with that right now, but it has been really thrilling, and the time is amazing. I mean, I can't believe that we're past the year point. The time is just zooming by so quickly. So I will stop there and open it up for questions. I was trying to filibuster. I know you guys have some really hard questions.
Have you ever been a road problem?
No, never. Because what I'm doing right now, is probably, one of the harder things for me to do. So I see what these guys do. It's amazing. And I'm just not an external person. It'd be really fun to do. I want to do other things too.
Do you have a favorite campaign story from all the campaigns?
Oh, all of my favorite ones probably have to be told when the camera's off. I have to think out there a lot. I mean, that's the neat thing. I think about campaigns is that you walk away. I mean, it's an incredible experience. It's so much fun. And you go through so much, like the highs and the lows, and like emotionally, it's like a roller coaster. And so you're going through this with all sorts of people, right? And so you create this incredible bond and friendship. You go through, these amazing experiences, and then you've got incredible stories to be able to share with folks. And I'll share a couple with you later.
Not a question, just a comment on, so often elected officials' career is defined by tragedy. Unexpected, unanticipated, there's nothing you can do about it. But it's how they handle that situation, how they show empathy, and how they are able to communicate. So my message back to you is, I think Jay's been doing a very, very good job on these kind of unexpected tragedies, as opposed to several Seattle mayors that I can think of that lost their jobs because they weren't able to.
Yeah, so I took this opportunity here to email out to my staff. One of the things that I was thinking about was, what kind of advice would I give folks who are interested in getting involved in public service and government work, and so I sort of outsourced that question to our staff. So I sent around an all-staff email to 63 people, and it was like, hey, I'm speaking this weekend, and here's something I want you guys to think about, and let me know what you would pass on. And got some really great responses back. Really terrific advice. But one that kind of emerged, Jan, similar to kind of your feedback, is how important it is to have that sort of listening empathetic, emotional piece. And so I think the people who succeed a lot in this public political business are people who have a high level of social and emotional intelligence, who are able to read people and sense what they're feeling, and being able to communicate back, what's appropriate, what's not appropriate, kind of being really not tone deaf to that social and emotional piece. I think that, that's something that we look for when we hire staff, and we're building a team of people who are very empathetic and who are good emotional communicators.
So earlier you talked about developing a relationship is very important. So how do you do the developing a relationship in the political area?
Alcohol is really important. That's what I learned in Washington, D.C. I think it is really understanding who's around you, the people that you're meeting, having a good sense of what you might be interested in and want to learn and know, and not being afraid to introduce yourself to people and go in and have coffee with folks and learn about what they're doing and how they got to where they are. So it's really, hearing people's story and figuring out the places that you connect with them, and thinking about how you can help them or they can help you, and not in a sleazy kind of way, but really supporting each other, and then staying in touch with folks. So if you sit down and have coffee with somebody, if you meet somebody, and you remember that they're interested in something, and that something comes up across your desk, and making that connection, and those, just building that kind of rapport and relationship, I think is important.
Joby, you exude so much confidence, and it's so great when those of us who are a generation ahead can learn so much from people like you. You really have done a lot in your age span. I mean, given your age, when you got this position, I mean, that's an awesome level of responsibility. How do you see that right now? I mean, what are your biggest challenges, and how do you overcome that? I mean, you're still fairly young, and you probably have a lot of people that are a different generation. Just kind of interesting in what goes through your mind now with this such a high level position.
I probably don't appreciate the position as much as I should, and I think I'm still learning and trying to figure out my role, responsibilities, and what the governor expects of me. But I think that what gives me comfort in knowing I think I can do this job is both our incredible staff. I've learned to trust the people who are working for us, and empowering them by letting them own a lot of things, which is great because it frees me up to do other things, and then it's fulfilling for them because they're doing some really meaningful work, making decisions, and being critical players and all of that. But I think the other piece is just my history and relationship with the governor. And so I've worked on and off for him for the last 17 years. And I think in the political world, when you are the governor or a city council member or any elected official, being able to know that you've got somebody on your side all the time, looking out for your best interest, and I think he trusts my judgment. That's a critical relationship to have. And it's not something that a lot of people for this particular governor can do. And so I think, when I think about my role, it's probably a little unique. There are a lot of other chief of staffs that have obviously come before me. Their relationships with their governors have been a little different. But I think my value in my role for this governor is just, as a trusted advisor who can anticipate what he's going to care about what's going to annoy him or frustrate him or the opportunities he's looking for. And so I can help, I can help him, I think, that way best. And I've worked with him and have hired a lot of folks over the years for whether it's a congressional office or a campaign team, and hiring people who reflect what's important to him when it comes to team and performance and outcomes and attitude. I think that works as well, and he's got a good comfort level there. So I think it's kind of sort of a rambling roundabout way of saying I think my relationship and my history makes this sort of a unique maybe position, and then we've just got a fantastic team. So.
I had a quick question about how has your approach to external communications changed? From the mid-90s to now, where you have so many outlets, so many voices. Obviously now you're in a management role, but how do you filter down? We're hearing from this blogger, how do you filter down what do we respond to and how we respond to it?
So we've got a communications team that, we've got a communications director, we've got a digital media director, and a press secretary and some other communication folks. And that team really manages our external communications, and they're just down the hall. And so, instead of having sort of this top-down management, that team will flag any sort of, we've got to respond to this, or we need to ignore that. And so what happens is they usually come up with a recommendation and say, this one's worth responding to. This is how we're going to respond. Is that fine? So it's a real collaborative. It really helps when your teams know what's important and how you want to position yourself, and they know kind of where we want to land on particular issues, and then they can make decisions based on where they know we want to be, and then the prickly ones will kind of come from the bottom up. And then sometimes, so this Gov really is like too into the comments section on blogs and reads a lot of that stuff, and he'll read 5 papers a day and 5 or 10 blog sites a day. So oftentimes he will kind of be ahead of some of us and and hair on fire about some things. But that's what's makes the day exciting. Did I answer your question?
Yeah.
I have something to say. As parents, like my mom, we our hopes is that they do a lot better than we did. And the mom could take the credit of taking the family up to another level. So, I really credit your mom that I love very dearly, and we've done a lot of good things together. So great.
I couldn't agree with you more. Yeah.
It seems to
You wanna
me,
set the record
listening
straight?
to you, that Jay has always articulated his policies and what he wants to do very clearly, publicly, and I know that that's also been a part of the hiring process. And so the communication, I would think, within the organization is a lot easier because there's that clarity of mission and his policies and what's important to him. And, we see that as just individual citizens and voters. For example, the issue with, what is the word I'm looking for? For suspending executions. Yeah, he didn't have to do that, but it was an example of what is important to him and his belief system. So, I think he's continually doing that, which makes it easier for everybody who works for him.
You talked a little bit earlier about how you saw your mom and others in your family being role models when you just say, this is normal for me, especially when it comes to being visible in the community. So do you feel like being an Asian, that you feel that you kind of carry a little bit of that weight on your shoulder, or being this role model for other Asians to see you and to be able to achieve where you are?
Candidly, I don't, but others do. Yeah, and I think that that's reflected in, being a woman too. Reflected in some of the hires that we make, and some of those decisions. But yeah, I think there is definitely that piece. Because, I feel really lucky and almost spoiled because, growing up on Beacon Hill to this mother, and this community, we were really lucky. And, not a lot of folks get to have sort of that perfect storm of civic engagement and community engagement. And so, so I think that being so saturated with that, and so, that it almost goes the other way, where I probably take that for granted. But, trying to make up for that in some of the hires that we're making, and some of the appointments, and, really trying to get communities of color and the Asian American community engaged in our policy and employed in state government, and with, contracts and procurement issues.
10 years from now, what do you feel you'll be doing, or what would you be enjoying?
I think 10 years from now, I would like to go back to my stained glass studio and really focus on that. I think that's what I like to do.
Do you still have the studio?
Yeah, so I still have the studio, and it's really more like storage, because I'm never there. I can't remember the last time I was there, but yeah. So I'm still kind of clinging on to the idea that someday.
Did you say you're still paying rent on that?
Yeah. And the thing that's so important is not, it's the space, but it's also the community. So there's just this really awesome community of painters and other artists that I share the space with, and so that's kind of what I'm holding on to, or the investment to, is sort of the right to still be in that space. So if I ever,
There in Georgetown?
it's actually, so this place is next to Boca, so it's like downtown, between First and Second, and Madison and Spring, I think. So it's not the original place that I was in. It's a new place. We were dislocated because the building, the old building I was in, is now being retrofitted and upgraded because the tunnel is going underneath it. And so the artists had to move out, and now they're scattered throughout the city. And there were a handful of us that ended up in this building on First Avenue. And so it's a neat group of people.
So I think Kip was your first campaign. So tell us about how you got involved or with that, and what was it like running your first campaign?
It was really hard. But what made it, so Kip is, terrific human being. So his office, the campaign office, was in his basement of his house, and his wife Barb was really involved in the campaign. She was the treasurer, and she kind of helped me manage Kip as well, which was needed at times. But I met Kip, so this is the whole relationship. Obviously, we've all known Kip for many years, but I served with him on the Seattle Commission on Children and Youth. He was a leader in the Human Services Child prevention of child abuse and neglect community, and just, so anyway, so we served on this commission together. I got to know him through the commission, and we just kept in touch, and at some point, he went to go seek the appointment when Gary Locke moved on. He didn't get the appointment, but was committed to running against whoever did, because he wanted to serve that community. Anyway, so I've been working on campaigns, and he said, you know, if I decide to do this, I want to run my campaign. So ended up practically living, you know, down in their basement for almost a year. But it was a hard, it's a different race. You're now, you know, as a campaign manager, you're responsible for everything. So, which is why I think campaign management is such a great experience, especially on these smaller races, because it's an opportunity for you to learn how to fundraise, to do press, to work with consultants, to do the field work, to work with volunteers, to do candidate management. And so all of that stuff is just sort of great on-job learning for all sorts of different other potential jobs and career opportunities. But
Who did he
you know,
run
working
against?
with what was that?
Who did he run
Vivian
against?
Caver. So Vivian Caver was chair of the 37th district, really, really wonderful woman. She was chair of the Democratic Party, the 37th district. So, you know, she was beloved by the PCOs, and she had all these relationships, and so she got the appointment. Because that's the process for these open seats. Anyway, so it was, you know, working with a candidate, you never know, you know, like we had a certain relationship, Kip and I, and then, you know, and then these people run for office, and some of you know what I'm talking about, Jan and Janice. You know, it's a really stressful thing for everyone, and it's incredibly exposing. You're tired, you're doing things you don't want to do, you're forced to do things that make you very, very uncomfortable, and so, you know, it just elevates, you know, a lot of tension and stress, and so getting used to that dynamic was a learning experience, and learning how to work with a committee, like a steering committee. So all these, you know, campaigns have advisory committees and steering committees that meet regularly to help with the campaign plan and, you know, help focus the candidate and help keep the campaign manager accountable and on task. And that was sort of the first real campaign committee that I was able to work with. So I got to work with people like Sharon Tomiko and Ruth Wu and George Scarola and some other folks. And it was really neat to get to work with all of those wonderful folks. And